What happens when a law that's designed to protect people is interpreted in a way that could leave them with nothing? Well, today, we're diving into a landmark Indian court case that wrestled with that exact problem. It's a story that redefined financial security for divorced Muslim women and forced everyone to ask, what does fairness really look like after a marriage ends?
And that's the central dilemma right there. See, back in 1986, India passed the Muslim Women Act, a law that was supposed to safeguard women's rights after a divorce. But here's the catch. A crucial bit of ambiguity in the wording kicked off a massive legal battle. So the big question became, would this law be a shield, or would it turn into a cage, limiting a woman's financial future for the rest of her life?
So let's just set the stage here. For anyone facing a divorce, one of the biggest, most immediate concerns is financial stability. How am I going to support myself? What does my future even look like? This case took that incredibly personal, very human question and put it right in front of the highest court in the land.
At the heart of it all was this fundamental issue. Exactly how far does a husband's financial responsibility to his ex-wife go? Is it just a short-term thing that ends pretty quickly, or is it something more, something that's meant to provide for her future well-being? This is the puzzle the courts had to piece together.
And this is the law right at the center of the storm, the Muslim Women Protection of Rights on Divorce Act of 1986. Now, on the surface, its purpose seems totally clear. It's about protection. But a few key words in this legislation would spark a debate that lasted for years about what that protection actually meant in the real world.
And this, right here, is the key phrase. The law said a husband has to provide a reasonable and fair provision and maintenance. Sounds straightforward, doesn't it? But all the ambiguity was hiding in the timing. When was this provision for exactly? And maybe more importantly, how long was it supposed to last?
Now, to really unlock this whole debate, we need to understand a specific term, the iddat period. This is a waiting period, typically a few months after a divorce where a woman can't remarry. Traditionally, a husband's financial support or maintenance was pretty much limited to this short window of time. The entire case really hinged on whether this new 1986 law was sticking to that old limit or expanding it.
And that leads us to the critical question. Was that reasonable and fair provision just a small payment to tide her over for the few months of the iddat period? Or was it meant to be a substantial, forward-thinking amount of money that could actually provide for her entire life, especially since, remarriage is never a guarantee?
So you ended up with two completely different interpretations. One side was arguing that the law meant a minimal, short-term payment, just enough to cover the iddat period, and that's it. But the other side was pushing a much bigger idea, that the payment, while made during that period, had to be calculated to provide for the woman's entire future. And believe me, this wasn't just a minor legal disagreement. It was the difference between temporary relief and lifelong security.
This question was too big to just stay a debate. It went to court, and not just any court. It went all the way to the Supreme Court in the landmark case of Danial Latifi versus the Union of India, which finally got its hearing in 2001. This was the ultimate test.
The legal challenge here was profound. The argument was simple but powerful. If the law only provided for that short iddat period, it would be unconstitutional. It would violate the fundamental rights to equality and a life with dignity that are guaranteed by the Indian Constitution. You'd essentially be creating a whole class of citizens left financially vulnerable by the law itself.
So the Supreme Court was now facing this monumental decision. They had to weigh the literal text of the 1986 Act against the foundational spirit of the Constitution. And the outcome? Well, it was going to be a defining moment. And remember, this wasn't just some abstract legal argument. The court's decision was going to have a direct, real-world impact on the lives of countless women across the country. We're talking their financial future, their security, their very ability to live with dignity. It all came down to this one judgment.
And then the decision came down. The Supreme Court spoke with absolute clarity. They ruled that the husband's responsibility, his duty to provide that reasonable and fair provision, was not limited to the brief iddat period alone. It extends beyond it.
So what did this mean in practice? It meant the payment couldn't just be survival money for a few months. It had to be a forward-looking calculation, a sum that was substantial enough to provide security for a woman's entire future. The court essentially transformed the whole concept of maintenance from a short-term fix to a lifelong provision.
This ruling was so much more than just the end of one case. It sent ripples through the legal and social fabric of the entire country. So let's talk about why this decision from 2001 still matters so much today.
So what were the core impacts? Well, first, the court actually saved the law itself. By interpreting it this way, they made it constitutional. It was this masterful move of harmonizing personal law with the universal rights of the Constitution. It secured real, long-term financial support for women, and most importantly, it clarified that maintenance is a lifelong provision, not a temporary band-aid.
Ultimately, the court just looked at the law's title, the Protection of Rights on Divorce Act, and chose an interpretation that actually delivered on that promise. They made sure the law would truly serve as a shield for the vulnerable, not a tool to limit their rights.
And this leaves us with a final thought. The Danial Latifi case is such a powerful example of how law isn't static. It can be interpreted, it can evolve to meet the demands of justice in a world that's always changing. It really forces us to ask, where else do our legal systems need to evolve to truly provide security for everyone? It's a question that's definitely worth considering.